The ocean is a dream that never wakes. It murmurs beneath the world, carrying stories older than memory, older than the first flame ever lit by human hands. When we listen closely, really listen, we can hear something within its rhythm, a whisper that speaks of a city swallowed by time, of towers now blanketed in coral, of lights that once burned beneath an endless blue. The ancients called it Atlantis. Some say it was a myth, a parable for human pride. Others insist it was a place as real as the waves that mourn its loss. But perhaps it was something far deeper, something meant not to entertain, but to warn. Imagine standing at the edge of a vast, still sea. The air tastes of salt and distance, the horizon a thin blade between light and eternity. As the tide slides over your feet, you feel something ancient stir beneath the surface. The sea remembers. It remembers everything humanity has tried to forget, our triumphs, our arrogance, our endless desire to control what was never ours to command. Somewhere beneath the calm, hidden by centuries of shifting sand and silt, lies the echo of a world that once believed it was invincible. The story of Atlantis has drifted through time like a piece of driftwood, reshaped and reimagined by every culture that found it. To some, it was the home of godlike beings who harnessed powers we can no longer comprehend. To others, it was a utopia, a civilization of peace and knowledge, undone by its own perfection. But beyond the myth lies a deeper truth, one that vibrates in harmony with every lost empire, every fallen city, every warning ignored. Atlantis was not just a place, it was a reflection, a mirror showing humanity the cost of forgetting humility. Plato was the first to give Atlantis a name that would never fade. In his dialogues, he described an island nation of extraordinary wealth and beauty, ruled by kings descended from gods, masters of the sea and sky. Yet even as he painted their glory, he whispered of their downfall. They became greedy, he wrote. They reached too far, desired too much, and for that, the gods cast them beneath the waves. Whether he spoke in metaphor or memory, his words endure because they resonate with something instinctive in us, the knowledge that every height we reach casts a shadow. Close your eyes and drift backward, past the age of kings and empires, past the first stone carved by human hands, into a time when the earth itself was younger and the boundaries between myth and history blurred. Beneath the waves, imagine streets paved in white stone, lined with towering columns that shimmer beneath the sun. Gardens of crystal and gold glimmer at the water's edge. The air hums with invention, with power, with the illusion that nothing can fall. And yet, somewhere deep within that perfection, a quiet tension builds, a single, invisible crack in the foundation of paradise. The ocean has no haste, yet it reclaims everything. It erases pride, crumbles monuments, and folds even the greatest achievements into its dark silence. The people of Atlantis, if they existed, must have watched the tides rise slowly at first, days turning into years, their magnificent walls beginning to falter. What must it have felt like to see the horizon swallow their world? To hear the rumble of water like an approaching storm, knowing there was nowhere left to run? The sea took their voices, but perhaps it did not take their message. Perhaps it left it drifting in our collective memory, waiting for someone to listen. Now, millennia later, we stand once again at the edge of the water, staring into the same horizon that watched Atlantis drown. We build towers that pierce the clouds, cities that shine like constellations, machines that can reach beyond the stars. Yet beneath our progress, the same whisper continues, a warning wrapped in myth, a lesson buried in beauty. Every civilization believes it is the exception. Every empire thinks it will last forever. But the ocean knows otherwise. Atlantis may never have existed as a single city or place, but its truth exists everywhere. It is found in the ruins of every fallen kingdom, in every monument swallowed by sand or sea, in the rise and fall that defines human history. It is the reminder that brilliance without balance becomes destruction, that power without wisdom turns inward like a storm. The sea remembers not out of malice, but out of mercy. It holds these memories so that we might one day learn to listen. So, as the waves move in endless rhythm, imagine their song carrying more than sound. Imagine them speaking in the voice of history, of countless civilizations before us. They whisper not of loss, but of return, of cycles repeating, of lessons unlearned. Atlantis wasn't a myth to be solved, nor a treasure to be found. It was a mirror held up to humanity, a reflection shimmering beneath the tide. And as the last light fades over the water, you begin to understand. The city beneath the waves was never truly gone. It is us. It has always been us. In the quiet corridors of time, a single name endures like a candle flickering in the dark: Plato. He was not merely a philosopher. He was a storyteller of civilizations, a man who understood that truth often hides best inside myth. More than 2,000 years ago, in the heart of ancient Greece, Plato sat among his students and spoke of a lost world beyond the pillars of Heracles. His words, recorded in two dialogues, Timaeus and Critias, were meant to be philosophical lessons. Yet within those lessons he planted the seed of one of humanity's greatest mysteries. Atlantis, he said, was a vast and powerful island empire that existed 9,000 years before his time, a civilization so advanced that it seemed divine. And then, in a single night and day of misfortune, it sank beneath the waves. Most have treated his tale as allegory. But what if it was more? What if Plato, who warned of human pride and excess in so many of his works, was not inventing a parable but preserving a memory? He was a philosopher obsessed with the idea of the ideal state, a society guided by wisdom and virtue rather than greed and desire. Perhaps Atlantis was his warning dressed as a dream, a reflection of a civilization that once achieved perfection and then fell because it believed itself untouchable. When Plato spoke of balance between reason and ambition, he might have been speaking from echoes that had reached him from a distant, half-remembered age. The dialogues themselves are filled with details too vivid to be pure imagination. He describes the island's concentric rings of land and water, its fertile plains, its glittering temples of orichalcum, a metal lost to history. He writes of canals, harbors, and ships that sailed beyond the known world. He even provides precise measurements and directions, placing Atlantis beyond the pillars of Heracles, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar. For centuries, scholars have argued over these details. Were they symbols or clues? Was Plato crafting a moral story, or recording a whispered truth handed down through generations of priests and travelers? It is easy to dismiss the story as metaphor, but Plato himself insisted it was history. In Timaeus, he attributes the tale to Solon, the wise lawgiver of Athens, who supposedly learned it from Egyptian priests in the city of Sais. The priests told Solon that Greece was young, its memory erased by floods and fire, while Egypt, protected by the Nile, still remembered an age when great civilizations rose and fell. They spoke of a mighty island empire that had waged war against the world, and perished when the gods decided its pride had grown unbearable. Solon never completed his account, and centuries later, Plato took up the fragments and shaped them into his dialogues. But what if Plato believed every word? The timing of his story is curious. Plato lived during an age of uncertainty, when Athens was recovering from war and political chaos. He had seen his teacher, Socrates, executed by the very democracy that claimed to value reason. Perhaps Atlantis was more than a distant myth. It was a mirror for Athens itself, a warning that even the greatest societies crumble when arrogance replaces wisdom. In this sense, Atlantis was not just about the past. It was about the eternal cycle of human folly. Every civilization carries the seeds of its own destruction, planted in its desire to dominate the world rather than understand it. Yet there are deeper layers still. Some historians argue that Plato may have drawn upon stories much older than Greece itself. His reference to Atlantis being 9,000 years before Solon would place it near the end of the last ice age, around the same period when scientists believe massive floods reshaped coastlines and drowned entire regions. It is possible that remnants of real events, ancient floods, the collapse of early coastal settlements, were preserved through oral tradition, passed from one generation to another until they reached the philosophers of Greece. Plato, then, might have been the last in a long chain of voices recounting a catastrophe so immense that it became myth. When we read Plato today, it is tempting to focus on the literal maps, locations, sunken ruins, but to do so misses his deeper genius. His words are not the desperate notes of a dreamer but the deliberate warning of a thinker who understood human nature. He wrote of Atlantis as a civilization blessed with abundance, wisdom, and divine favor, but cursed by its inability to remain humble. They were, in his words, filled with unrighteous ambition and power. The gods, saddened by their decline, unleashed earthquakes and floods that consumed the island. It was, in essence, a story of imbalance, a theme as relevant now as it was in his time. Plato's account leaves much unfinished. Critias, the dialogue that describes Atlantis in detail, ends abruptly, as if the philosopher had been interrupted mid-thought. The tale cuts off before the final destruction is fully described. Was it a fragment lost to time, or did Plato choose to leave it incomplete? A silence meant to mirror the silence of the sea? That break in the narrative has haunted thinkers for centuries. Some see it as evidence that the story was incomplete myth-making. Others suspect it was deliberate, a gesture meant to remind us that no civilization's story ever truly ends. It simply vanishes beneath the waves, waiting to be rediscovered. The most haunting aspect of Plato's Atlantis is not its grandeur, but its familiarity. Its people were not monsters or gods, they were us. They built wonders, achieved mastery over their world, and then allowed greed and self-assurance to eclipse wisdom. The parallels to our own age are impossible to ignore. In the quiet between Plato's words lies the echo of a timeless truth. Every time humanity forgets its limits, the sea rises again to remind us. Perhaps that is why the legend refuses to die. For more than 2 millennia, scholars, dreamers, and explorers have tried to find Atlantis, to anchor Plato's warning in stone and geography. Yet what if the real treasure is not beneath the ocean, but within his message? Atlantis is not just a sunken city, it is an eternal lesson encoded in philosophy. It is the moment when the pursuit of perfection turns to ruin, when enlightenment becomes pride, and when civilization forgets the humility that sustains it. And so, when Plato spoke of a city swallowed by the sea, he was not describing fantasy. He was holding a mirror to humanity's soul, showing us what happens when we mistake greatness for goodness. His dialogues endure not because they tell us where Atlantis was, but because they whisper something far more urgent, that the line between myth and history is as fragile as a reflection on water. We search for Atlantis in maps and ruins, but the truth of it, the warning, has always been closer than we think. It lives in our ambitions, in our achievements, and in the silent spaces where pride begins to drown wisdom. Long before Plato ever set ink to parchment, before marble cities and written words, the earth itself carried memories too ancient for history to hold. There was a time when ice ruled the world, a time of giants, both animal and human, when continents were colder, and the seas lay hundreds of feet lower than they do now. The end of that frozen age came with a trembling, a slow and relentless thaw that reshaped everything humanity knew. Rivers carved new paths through stone, mountains cracked, and coastlines crept inward. For those who lived through it, it must have felt like the end of the world. And in many ways it was. The ocean was rising, and with each wave, it erased another piece of a world we would never see again. Picture the Earth around 12,000 years ago. The glaciers were melting at a pace unseen before, releasing torrents of icy water into the oceans. The air was filled with mist and the cries of migrating animals, their instincts driving them to flee an invisible catastrophe. In coastal lands, vast stretches of fertile plains that are now buried beneath the sea, early humans watched their horizons vanish. They were not primitive wanderers as we once imagined. They built dwellings, shaped tools of remarkable precision, mapped the stars, and worshipped the rhythm of the seasons. Their world was sophisticated, spiritual, and deeply connected to the forces of nature. And then, slowly, the water began to rise. At first, it might have seemed like nothing more than a strange change in the weather. But as the tides crept higher and rivers swelled, the truth became undeniable. Entire regions began to disappear. Valleys turned to marshes, marshes to lakes, and lakes to ocean. For countless generations, families watched the land of their ancestors sink beneath the waves. Imagine the fear and disbelief, watching temples, fields, and homes vanish under the sea, powerless to stop it. To them, it was not science, it was punishment, perhaps the wrath of gods or the collapse of the world's balance. What they could not understand through knowledge, they preserved through story. And so began the Great Migration, a silent exodus of survivors who carried their memories across continents. They wandered to higher ground, taking with them the knowledge of agriculture, stonework, and celestial observation. They became the seeds of the civilizations that followed. The myths they told, of floods, of drowned worlds, of divine retribution, were echoes of what they had lived through. In every ancient tale of water and loss, there lies a faint reflection of that great deluge at the end of the Ice Age. Modern science, peering through sonar and satellite, has found traces of their vanished world. Off the coasts of India, strange geometric structures lie submerged, the ruins near Dvarka, long thought to be myth, now visible beneath layers of silt. Off the shores of Japan, the Yonaguni monument rises from the sea floor, massive terraces and platforms cut into stone, their edges eerily precise, as if crafted by hands long forgotten. In the Mediterranean, the seabed reveals entire landscapes, walls, roads, and harbors swallowed by time. Each discovery adds a whisper of validation to humanity's oldest legends. The ocean floor has become a museum of the impossible, where myth and archaeology meet in uneasy silence. There are places beneath the waves where divers speak of standing stones arranged in deliberate circles, staircases that lead nowhere, and pillars worn smooth by the patient hands of the sea. Scientists argue whether these formations are natural or man-made, but perhaps the answer lies somewhere in between. Nature may have shaped the canvas, but human civilization could have once carved upon it. After all, we have always built close to water, for life, for trade, for beauty. If the rising seas reclaimed our cities today, how long would it take before they, too, were mistaken for natural formations? A few thousand years, perhaps, a blink in geological time. When the seas rose, the memory of those lost cities did not vanish, it transformed. Across the world, cultures that never met shared remarkably similar stories. The Sumerians wrote of a great flood sent by the gods. The Hebrews told of Noah and the Ark. The Hindus spoke of Manu, the first man saved from the waters. The Greeks told of Deucalion and Pyrrha, who survived the flood to repopulate the earth. Even in the Americas, in the jungles of Mesoamerica, myths spoke of a world destroyed by deluge, only to begin again. How could such distant peoples share such a specific memory unless it was born from a shared experience? A catastrophe written into the DNA of humanity itself. The idea that Atlantis was a memory rather than a myth begins to take shape here. The lost island, described by Plato, may have been one of many coastal civilizations that succumbed to the rising seas. Its grandeur, its sudden fall, and its moral lesson could all stem from an ancient event witnessed and retold until it transcended history. What we call myth, the ancients might have called survival. They did not invent these stories. They carried them, like relics of a world drowned but not forgotten. Imagine one of those survivors, thousands of years ago, sitting by a fire on newly claimed land, speaking softly to their children of the world that once was. There was a city, they might have said, where the temples touched the sky and the rivers ran clear as glass. But its people forgot gratitude. They grew powerful, and the earth grew angry. One night, the sea rose up and took it all. To the listener, it was a story of gods and punishment. But beneath the poetry was memory, the memory of a rising tide and a vanishing home. Atlantis, by any name, was the ghost of that moment. In the millennia that followed, the earth's wounds healed. Forests grew over the scars of the flood, and the oceans settled into their present form. Humanity began again, smaller, scattered, but wiser. The survivors became the teachers, the builders of new civilizations. Their stories, told and retold, became scripture, myth, and legend. And through those words, the lost world endured. The whisper of the flood became a heartbeat that echoes through every culture's origin tale. Even now, when scientists map the seabed and discover the remains of forgotten coastlines, they are not uncovering mysteries. They are rediscovering memories, the same memories that once inspired Plato to write of Atlantis. The ocean, in its endless patience, has always been both destroyer and preserver. It buries, but it also keeps. Beneath its depths lie not only the ruins of ancient lands but the truth of who we were, dreamers, builders, and witnesses to the first global cataclysm. Whether we call it Atlantis, Dvarka, or any of 100 other names, the meaning is the same: humanity has fallen before, and we have risen again. The sea's silence is not empty, it is full of voices. And when we listen closely enough, through the hum of the tides and the pulse of the earth, we can still hear the faint echo of those who watched their world disappear beneath the waves, leaving behind a single enduring message: remember. There are stones on this earth that seem too old to belong to us. They stand in silent defiance of time, cut and shaped with precision that humbles even the most advanced tools of today. When we touch them, it is as if we are touching a language older than speech, a memory carved in granite. These are the monuments of the forgotten builders, the architects of a world that predates our history books. Their cities and temples rose long before the written word, before kingdoms and kings, before even the myths that tried to remember them. And though their names are lost, their works remain, whispering through the ages of knowledge once held and then erased. At the heart of this mystery lies a single question: who were they? Modern history teaches that civilization began around 5,000 years ago, with Sumer and Egypt. Yet scattered across the globe are structures that challenge that timeline. Places like Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, a megalithic temple built over 11,000 years ago, at a time when humanity was supposedly still learning to farm. Its pillars weigh tons, carved with intricate symbols of animals and celestial patterns. No one can fully explain how it was built, or why its creators buried it deliberately beneath layers of earth. The stones themselves seem to whisper that it belonged to a people who understood the heavens and the earth in ways we no longer do. Far to the south, in the windswept deserts of Egypt, the Great Pyramid of Giza rises like a fossilized dream. Even now, with laser instruments and computer modeling, no one can fully replicate its precision. The joints between its blocks are tighter than the thickness of a fingernail. Its alignment to the stars is perfect, not by chance but by design. The deeper one looks, the clearer it becomes. The builders of these monuments were not crude laborers, but mathematicians, astronomers, and engineers guided by a profound understanding of cosmic order. The pyramid may not have been built by Atlanteans, but it stands as a monument to a lineage of knowledge that feels too ancient, too deliberate, to be coincidence. Across the oceans, similar stories emerge. In South America, the stones of Pumapunku in Bolivia lie scattered across a high plain, cut with precision so fine that even a modern diamond saw would struggle to match it. Each block fits with the next like pieces of a cosmic puzzle. The Inca, who inherited the site, claimed it was built long before their ancestors walked the land, by gods or by giants. On Easter Island, colossal heads stare blankly toward the sea, their faces eroded by centuries of wind, yet their craftsmanship unyielding. In Malta, temples older than the pyramids rise from the earth, aligned to the sun's path at solstice. And on the seafloor near Yonaguni, massive stairways and terraces form geometric patterns too exact to ignore. Across continents and oceans, the same patterns repeat: mastery of stone, reverence for the stars, and an understanding of balance between earth and sky. It is tempting to believe that these were isolated achievements, separate bursts of genius from different peoples. But when viewed together, they feel connected, as if they are fragments of one great story told in different languages. Could these monuments be the last remnants of an earlier global culture, a network of builders who once shared a unified understanding of the world? Perhaps the survivors of the great floods carried their knowledge outward, rebuilding pieces of their lost world in scattered corners of the earth. Each monument, then, would be a memory, a message from a civilization trying not to be forgotten. Imagine a time when knowledge was not confined by borders or names, when the world's first astronomers tracked the movement of stars to mark the changing of seasons, when builders aligned temples to celestial events to honor the rhythm of creation itself. Their architecture was not just functional, it was spiritual, an act of balance between humanity and the cosmos. The stones they placed were instruments in a greater symphony, each block resonating with meaning. They may not have had writing as we know it, but they wrote their story in structure and alignment, in geometry and stone. Over millennia, the memory of those builders blurred into legend. Ancient texts spoke of gods descending from the heavens to teach humanity the arts of civilization. The Sumerians wrote of the Anunnaki, divine beings who brought order to chaos. The Egyptians remembered Thoth, the scribe of the gods, who gave them writing and measurement. The Greeks spoke of Prometheus, who stole fire from heaven. In Mesoamerica, Quetzalcoatl was the feathered serpent who brought knowledge and light to humankind. Perhaps these gods were not divine beings at all, but remnants of an older people, the last inheritors of a forgotten age, mistaken for deities because their wisdom was beyond comprehension. Archaeologists often dismiss such ideas as speculation, yet the similarities between ancient monuments cannot be ignored. The alignment of pyramids across continents, the near-identical myths of civilizing teachers, the use of sacred geometry, these threads weave a tapestry too intricate to dismiss as coincidence. Maybe what we call myth was simply the world's way of remembering a truth too immense to fit inside a single story. Maybe Atlantis was not one city, but the collective memory of that lost global culture, a civilization that rose before the flood and fell beneath its waters. As centuries turned to millennia, the knowledge of these builders became fragmented. Some of it survived in secret traditions, the measuring of the heavens, the geometry of sacred spaces, the understanding that every structure must honor both the earth below and the sky above. But much of it vanished, leaving behind only the stones, like pages torn from an unreadable book. When explorers and scholars first rediscovered these ruins, they marveled at their age and beauty, but failed to grasp their message. These ancient builders were not merely constructing temples, they were preserving memory, encoding in stone the lessons of balance, humility, and harmony that their own civilization had forgotten. In their silence, these monuments still speak. They remind us that we are not the first to build great cities, nor the first to think ourselves invincible. They are proof that intelligence, creativity, and ambition have walked this earth many times before, each era leaving behind traces for the next to find. And perhaps, if Atlantis truly existed, it was not a single island swallowed by the sea but the sum of these lost ages, a golden era when humanity and nature were still in rhythm, before the tides of time swept it all away. As the sun rises over Göbekli Tepe or sets behind the pyramids, the same light touches both, bridging 10,000 years in a single moment. It reminds us that knowledge is not linear, it is cyclical. Civilizations rise, reach their zenith, and fall, but the earth remembers. The stones endure, holding the resonance of every lost empire within their grain. And if we listen, if we quiet the noise of our modern world long enough, we may still hear the faint echo of those forgotten builders, whispering across the centuries, "We were here. We knew. And we tried to leave a sign." The end did not come quietly. It began with fire in the sky. Somewhere above the northern horizon, a light appeared, brighter than the moon, colder than the sun. It burned across the heavens with a tail of silver dust, splitting the night in two. For those who looked up, it must have seemed like a new star, a divine omen. But soon the heavens themselves began to fall. The air trembled. The earth convulsed. In that single moment, the age of the forgotten builders ended, and the world was remade. What followed was an apocalypse written not in myth, but in geology. The Younger Dryas, a sudden, violent return to cold and chaos around 12,800 years ago. The warmth of the earth vanished, replaced by fire, flood, and darkness. It was the great reset of human history, the night the sky fell. Scientists now tell us that something immense struck the earth, perhaps a comet or a swarm of fragments exploding in the atmosphere. The impact theory explains the mysterious black layers found in ancient sediments, thin bands of carbon and ash scattered across continents, each one marking the same catastrophic event. Within those dark layers lie tiny glass beads, melted in unimaginable heat, and nanodiamonds formed in the blink of an instant. Something came from the sky and changed everything. Oceans boiled. Forests burned. Ice sheets melted in torrents that swallowed entire regions. Within a generation, the climate swung from gentle warmth to a brutal freeze. Species vanished. Rivers changed course. Civilizations, if they existed, were wiped from the map. The survivors would one day call it the Great Flood. Imagine standing in that moment. The night glows red as the air itself catches fire. Winds scream across the land, carrying ash and smoke. Thunder roars not from clouds but from the earth, splitting mountains, collapsing valleys. Lightning dances across oceans as if the world is being rewritten by the hands of the gods. In coastal cities, if such cities existed, temples tremble, statues topple, and walls of water rise higher than any tower. The sea invades the land. People flee toward mountains, clutching their children, praying to gods that can no longer answer. They look to the horizon, but the horizon is gone. There is only the endless surge of water and flame. In every myth of the flood, there is a common thread: the idea of divine punishment, of arrogance brought low. To the ancients who survived, there could be no other explanation. A world so advanced, so radiant, could not simply vanish by accident. It had to be judgment, a cosmic correction. But we, standing thousands of years later, see a different story. The heavens did not fall because of wrath. They fell because of inevitability. The earth moves through fields of debris left by ancient comets, and sometimes, fate demands a toll. Yet the metaphor remains: destruction follows pride, and renewal follows destruction. Nature itself mirrors the moral of Atlantis. As the comet struck, ice sheets in the north shattered. Glacial lakes the size of continents burst their boundaries, sending walls of water across the world. North America drowned. Europe shivered beneath a sudden freeze. The sea levels rose, consuming coastlines from Asia to the Americas. In this chaos, the memory of entire cultures may have been swept away. What we call prehistory may simply be what the flood erased. The great monuments that now lie under the sea could be their tombstones, silent witnesses to a cataclysm that reshaped both the earth and the human spirit. In the silence that followed, the world must have seemed alien. The air was colder. The light was dimmer. For centuries, the survivors lived in the shadows of what once was, carrying stories of a time when humanity had touched the stars and then been cast down. The myths that would later emerge, of gods warring in the heavens, of fire and water cleansing the earth, were born from these ashes. The survivors became the storytellers, the keepers of the memory. Atlantis, then, was not simply lost to the sea. It was buried beneath the trauma of a world reborn in chaos. Even today, the evidence lingers like scars. Across the globe, scientists have found signs of massive fires, layers of soot and charcoal marking a continent-wide inferno. In Greenland's ice cores, traces of platinum tell of something extraterrestrial. In the sediments of ancient lakes, the story of a sudden freeze plays out like a requiem. These are the echoes of that ancient day. They tell us that the planet once shuddered beneath a force beyond imagination, a force that erased entire ecosystems and sent humanity back into the darkness. And yet, from that darkness, something new emerged. The people who lived through it became wanderers, carrying fragments of their lost world into the next age. Their knowledge became legend, their technology became magic, and their cities became myths. The memory of Atlantis may have been their greatest story, not of perfection lost, but of survival against the impossible. The flood was not the end of humanity, but its transformation. The world that followed was colder, harsher, and more humble. The survivors built smaller, prayed more often, and remembered the warning etched in the stars. But even in the face of annihilation, the cycle of pride and fall did not end. Humanity forgets easily. The same fire that destroyed Atlantis still burns within us, the urge to master the world, to reach higher than wisdom allows. Plato's warning, born from echoes of this catastrophe, speaks as clearly now as it did millennia ago. The fall of the ancient world was not an isolated event, it was the beginning of a pattern. Civilization rises, stretches toward heaven, and then, blinded by its own brilliance, collapses beneath the weight of its ambition. The Younger Dryas was more than a geological event. It was a wound in the collective memory of humankind. The oceans rose to reclaim their balance, the skies reminded us of our fragility, and the earth began again. From that devastation, a new era was born, one that would eventually lead to the civilizations we know today. But deep within our stories, buried under layers of religion, philosophy, and folklore, the memory of that night remains. We still feel it in our bones, in our fascination with the end of the world, in our tales of lost lands and divine punishment. Perhaps that is the true legacy of Atlantis, not the ruins beneath the sea, but the memory of survival written into the human soul. Every flood myth, every apocalyptic vision, every dream of a golden age destroyed by hubris is a distant echo of that same event. The fire that fell from the sky was both destroyer and creator. It ended one world and gave birth to another. And in that rebirth, humanity was given a choice, to remember the lesson or to repeat it. When the oceans finally calmed and the smoke faded into the horizon, the survivors looked out upon a changed world. Their cities were gone, their gods were silent, but the stars above remained. In those stars, they saw both their past and their future, a reminder that everything, even destruction, follows a pattern. They began to rebuild, guided by memory, by story, and by the quiet whisper of the sea that had taken so much and yet left them alive. The sky had fallen, but the spirit endured. Atlantis was gone, but its warning had just begun to echo. In the centuries that followed the cataclysm, humanity lived as ghosts in the shadow of its own forgotten greatness. The survivors were scattered, small tribes clinging to life in a colder, harsher world. The oceans had swallowed the old coastlines, and with them, the cities that once glimmered with lights and learning. The air itself seemed heavier, the skies often gray, the seasons unpredictable. Crops failed. Animals vanished. The world that once nurtured abundance had become a test of endurance. But amid this long winter of the earth, something remarkable began to stir. The slow rebirth of memory, the fragile flicker of civilization reigniting from the embers of a lost age. In caves and mountainsides, the survivors told stories of what came before, stories of great cities swallowed by the sea, of towers that touched the heavens, of stars that fell to punish human pride. These were not mere myths, they were encoded memories. A people who had seen fire rain from the sky could not write their history in books, but they could carve it into stone, pass it through generations, wrap it in the poetry of fear and reverence. And so, the first myths of the gods were born, the sky fathers and sea mothers who could create or destroy worlds. To remember the destruction was to remember respect. To forget was to invite it again. Archaeologists now uncover strange evidence that challenges our sense of history. At Göbekli Tepe in modern-day Turkey, ancient builders erected megalithic pillars more than 11,000 years ago, long before agriculture or cities were supposed to exist. The carvings on those stones depict animals, celestial symbols, and what appears to be a falling comet. Some scholars suggest that these were the survivors of the cataclysm, encoding in sacred stone the event that nearly erased them. Göbekli Tepe was not merely a temple, it was a message. It said, "We remember what the sky can do." Across the world, echoes of that memory appear in different forms. In the Americas, stories of the sky serpent tell of fire that fell and reshaped the land. In Egypt, ancient texts speak of a flood that drowned the island of flames. In India, the Mahabharata describes celestial weapons that scorched the earth and brought darkness over the sun. These tales, scattered across continents and cultures, are too similar to be coincidence. They speak of a shared trauma, a moment when humanity's world ended and began again. The myth of Atlantis was only one variation of a much older, universal story. But myths alone were not enough. The survivors needed more than memory, they needed order. From chaos came hierarchy, ritual, and reverence. They began to worship the forces they could not control, the sun that warmed, the sea that consumed, the sky that watched. Early temples were built not for comfort, but for remembrance. Every stone placed was a prayer against forgetting. Civilization, in its earliest rebirth, was not born from curiosity or ambition. It was born from fear of another fall. The survivors built in alignment with the stars, tracking celestial cycles, hoping to read in their patterns the warning signs of another disaster. The sky had destroyed them once, now it became their teacher. In this new world, legends began to take shape around figures who carried remnants of the old knowledge. In every ancient culture, there are tales of bringers of wisdom, teachers who came from across the sea, bearing strange tools and stories of a lost homeland. The Sumerians spoke of Oans, the fishman who emerged from the water to give them laws and writing. The Mayans told of Kukulkan, the feathered serpent who brought them science and architecture. The Egyptians revered Thoth, the god of wisdom who remembered the ages before the flood. These were not merely gods, they were messengers, echoes of those who had survived the fall of Atlantis, wanderers carrying the last fragments of a broken civilization. To the people of the new dawn, these bringers of knowledge must have seemed divine. They built monuments to honor them, pyramids to imitate their lost cities, rituals to preserve their memory. The knowledge they carried became myth, and myth became the foundation of belief. The idea of Atlantis, though unnamed, began to pulse quietly within human culture, the story of a world that fell, of wisdom buried beneath the sea, of a warning disguised as legend. But even as humanity rebuilt, the memory of destruction began to fade. Each new generation saw the world not as something recently remade, but as eternal and unchanging. They looked upon their growing cities and forgot the fragility beneath them. The flood had turned into a story. The comet had turned into a god's anger. The lesson, that arrogance invites annihilation, became a parable, softened by time and retold as entertainment rather than warning. The survivors had built to remember, but their descendants built to forget. Yet traces of that ancient fear persisted in architecture and myth. Civilizations around the world shared a strange obsession with floods, with celestial order, with the geometry of the stars. The pyramids of Giza align almost perfectly with Orion's belt, a constellation that, to ancient astronomers, marked both time and destiny. The builders of Stonehenge and Nabta Playa studied solstices and eclipses, seeking to understand when the heavens might again betray them. The ruins of forgotten cities beneath the sea, off the coasts of Japan, India, and the Caribbean, whisper that the oceans have risen before. Every stone laid by ancient hands carried a silent question: will it happen again? As the centuries passed, the survivors' memories became civilizations, and their fears became faiths. The gods of the old world became the guardians of the new. Fire and water were not just elements, they were moral forces, rewarding humility and punishing hubris. And yet, despite all their rituals and reverence, humanity began once more to ascend. Villages became cities, cities became empires, and knowledge flourished again. The pattern was beginning anew. But deep beneath the calm of progress, something remained unresolved, a memory buried but not gone. The earth itself held the truth in its rocks, in the black layers of ash, in the magnetic scars of ancient fire. And though people had forgotten the exact details, they still felt it, as if an instinct whispered across generations: we have fallen before. That whisper guided dreams, haunted prophets, and inspired philosophers. The myth of Atlantis would later emerge as the crystallization of that collective memory, the story of a civilization punished for its pride, not by gods, but by the universe itself. The survivors had intended their message as a warning, carved in myth so it would never die. But as humanity rebuilt and the stars once again became a source of fascination rather than fear, the message was misinterpreted. Atlantis became a legend of beauty and power, not humility and loss. People remembered the splendor but forgot the sorrow. They sought to find the lost city, not to heed its warning. And so, the cycle began to close upon itself once more. The morning after the commander's rage hung heavy over the valley. The sky was gray, the kind of colorless dawn that makes everything seem half forgotten, half dreamed. The soldiers marched through the streets again, their boots splashing through puddles left by the night's rain. The villagers watched from behind shuttered windows, afraid even to breathe too loudly. It felt like the entire world was holding its breath. But the girl, standing by the edge of the stream, didn't flinch. She watched the water flow, slow, steady, unstoppable. That was how she wanted to fight now. Not with noise or fire, but with quiet endurance, the kind that erodes even the hardest stone. Her father told her to stay inside that day. He could see the tension thickening in the air. The soldiers were on edge, and fear had made them unpredictable. But she couldn't stay still. She had seen too much, learned too much. The fog had taught her patience, the river had taught her rhythm, and the silence had taught her how to listen. She began to move through the village again, not boldly, but like a whisper. She noticed things others overlooked, where the soldiers stored their spare boots to dry, which tents faced the wind, how the cook cursed when the fire smoked too much. Every small flaw was an opportunity waiting to be used. By dusk, she had already set a new plan in motion. The soldiers had built makeshift stables near the old granary. The horses, restless from the noise and lack of space, kicked and neighed through the night. She had overheard one soldier say they planned to move the animals at first light. That gave her time. As the village slept, she crept out with 2 other children, the blacksmith's son and the baker's youngest daughter. Together, they moved through the mist, their lanterns covered so only the faintest glow escaped. When they reached the stables, she motioned for silence. The blacksmith's son loosened the latch on one of the gates while the girls scattered handfuls of salt beneath the hay, enough to make the horses uneasy, restless. The baker's daughter left a small pouch of crushed berries that smelled faintly of smoke and sour fruit. They worked in silence, communicating with gestures. When they were done, they slipped away before the first hint of dawn. By morning, the camp was in chaos. Horses bucked, kicking over barrels and tearing loose from their ropes. Soldiers shouted, trying to calm them, but their fear only made the animals wilder. One broke free completely, crashing into the commander's tent. From her window, the girl watched it all unfold with a strange mix of satisfaction and dread. She knew this victory would not go unnoticed. When an empire feels mocked, it strikes back twice as hard. The commander's voice echoed across the square, furious, demanding to know who had done it. No one spoke. The villagers lowered their eyes, the silence between them now stronger than any oath. The punishment came quickly. A curfew was announced. No one was allowed outside after sunset. Guards were posted at every corner, torches burning through the night. The commander believed fear would root out disobedience. But fear, she had learned, could also be a weapon turned against its wielder. The more he tightened his grip, the more cracks appeared between his own men. That night, she stayed by the window long after her parents had gone to bed. The fog rolled in again, soft and endless. She imagined the valley watching her back, every hill, every tree, every silent house. It felt as if the land itself was awake, aware. She whispered a promise into the mist, the same way her mother whispered prayers. "They think they own this place," she murmured, "but it remembers who it belongs to." Over the next week, she focused on listening. It became her greatest weapon. The soldiers spoke freely when they thought no one understood them. She lingered near wells and corners, pretending to sweep or fetch water, absorbing every word. She learned that the commander was under pressure. His superiors expected progress, results, control. Supplies were running low. Morale was collapsing. Even the weather was turning against them. The rains had made the road impassable, cutting them off from reinforcements. That was when she began spreading rumors. Nothing overt, nothing traceable. She told the woodcutter's wife, in a whisper, that one of the soldiers had been seen burying treasure near the forest. By the next evening, 3 soldiers had gone searching for it, arguing among themselves. She hinted to a merchant that one of the commander's aides planned to desert. Within days, suspicion poisoned the camp. Orders were delayed, arguments broke out. Men began guarding their rations from each other. The army that once moved like a single machine was now pulling itself apart from the inside. But even as she watched their control unravel, she couldn't ignore the cost. The villagers lived in constant fear. Children cried at night, haunted by the sound of distant shouting. Her own mother grew quieter each day, her hands trembling as she lit candles. Her father had aged years in weeks, his face lined with worry. The girl often wondered if she had gone too far, if she was trading one kind of suffering for another. Yet every time she saw the soldiers, heard their mocking laughter, saw their cruelty disguised as order, her doubts hardened into resolve. One night, the fog was thicker than she had ever seen it. It swallowed the entire village until even her own hands looked like ghosts in front of her. She moved through it like part of the mist itself, carrying a single candle cupped in her palms. Its flame was small, fragile, but steady. She placed it by the riverbank, a signal. From across the valley, faint glows appeared in response. Dozens of tiny lights, flickering like stars fallen to earth. The villagers were with her. The resistance had grown far beyond her reach. The next day, something remarkable happened. A soldier, the same young man she had seen by the fire weeks ago, approached her father's forge, unarmed. He looked exhausted, his uniform torn, his eyes hollow. He asked for water. Her father hesitated but gave it. The man drank slowly, glancing around nervously before speaking in broken words of their language. "No more fight," he said, pointing toward the camp. "Men tired, hungry, cold." The girl listened from behind the doorway. There was no triumph in his voice, only despair. It struck her, even the enemy had reached their breaking point. That evening, she walked alone to the edge of the camp. She didn't go inside, she just watched from the shadows. The soldiers looked smaller now, their fires dimmer, their movements sluggish. For the first time, she saw them not as conquerors but as lost souls trying to survive a war they no longer believed in. The thought didn't weaken her resolve, it deepened it. It made her realize that true victory was not about destroying them. It was about enduring longer, holding on until the cruelty devoured itself. When she returned home, she found her mother awake, waiting by the fire. "You're not the same girl anymore," her mother said softly. "You've become something else." The girl didn't answer. The retreat began slowly, almost uncertainly, as though the soldiers themselves could not believe they were leaving. At first, only a few wagons rolled out of camp, their wheels creaking in the damp earth. Then, one by one, tents were dismantled, fires smothered, weapons packed away. The valley watched in silence. No one dared to cheer or speak. The villagers peered from their windows as the once mighty army, which had arrived like a storm, now shrank into a tired procession of men too weary to lift their heads. The girl stood at the edge of the road, hidden behind a tree, her breath caught in her chest. It felt unreal, not a victory march, but the fading echo of a nightmare. Mud clung to the soldiers' boots. Their banners, once bright and terrifying, now hung limp, stained with rain and ash. Horses stumbled under the weight of broken carts. The commander rode in silence, his face pale beneath his visor. He didn't look back at the village, perhaps out of shame, or perhaps because he knew there was nothing left here for him but the reminder of failure. The girl studied his posture, once straight and commanding, now bent like an old man's. It was strange to feel pity for someone who had brought so much suffering, but there it was, unbidden. Even enemies could look human when they'd lost everything they thought made them powerful. As the last ranks passed through the fog, something inside her shifted. She had spent so many nights imagining revenge, planning each act of resistance with a cold, steady heart. Now, seeing them defeated, she felt no triumph. Just a vast, quiet exhaustion. The war had devoured so much: laughter, warmth, innocence, and even in victory, it had left emptiness behind. She turned away before the last soldier disappeared, unable to bear the hollow feeling that followed them into the forest. That evening, the village gathered in the square for the first time in months. No torches burned from foreign hands, no voices barked commands. The silence was different now, not fearful but uncertain. People looked at one another as if seeing ghosts returned from the dead. The air smelled of damp wood and smoke, the remnants of the soldiers' campfires still drifting through the wind. The girl's father stood near the well, shoulders squared but eyes glassy. Her mother clutched her shawl, whispering prayers of thanks. No one knew what to say, as if speech itself had grown unfamiliar. Then, slowly, someone began to sing. It was an old song, one the villagers hadn't dared to sing since before the invasion. A song of harvest, of the river, of life that endured no matter what came. One voice became 2, then 10, until the whole square hummed with sound. It was not loud, but it was steady, carrying through the cold air like a heartbeat returning to a sleeping body. The girl stood among them, her eyes wet, her lips moving with the words she had nearly forgotten. The melody wound through the night, wrapping around the broken homes and charred fields, filling every hollow place left behind by fear. When the song ended, the silence that followed was not heavy. It was sacred. The villagers began to speak again, softly at first, then with growing energy. Plans were made to repair the mill, to replant the fields, to rebuild what had been lost. Children chased one another between the houses, laughing again. It felt fragile, this return to life, but it was real. The girl walked among them quietly, watching, listening. Some called her brave, others called her foolish, but most said nothing at all. They didn't need to. Their eyes said enough. They knew who had kept the valley alive when all seemed lost. That night she walked alone to the river. The fog drifted low across the water, silver in the moonlight. The surface reflected the sky like a mirror, still and endless. She knelt by the bank, trailing her fingers through the cold current. It was the same river that had carried the soldiers' reflections weeks before, the same one that had hidden her footsteps. But now it looked different, calmer, freer. She whispered to it as though it were an old friend. "You saw everything," she said softly. "You kept my secrets." The river said nothing, but the ripples seemed to nod. Behind her, the village glowed faintly with lamplight. For the first time, the fires burned without fear. She could hear laughter again, the creak of doors opening, the sound of a fiddle playing somewhere in the distance. The valley was waking from its long sleep, but the girl couldn't quite join their celebration. Not yet. Something in her had changed too deeply. She had seen what people became when pressed to the edge, the cruelty of invaders, the courage of neighbors, the way fear could twist or forge a soul. Her mother found her by the river and wrapped her arms around her shoulders. "It's over," she whispered. The girl leaned into her warmth but didn't answer. Over was a strange word. The soldiers were gone, yes, but the shadows they left behind still lingered in her dreams. Every sound in the dark still made her tense, every sudden silence still felt like danger. Some things, she knew, would take longer to leave than soldiers on a road. In the days that followed, life returned slowly. The villagers shared what little they had, repaired fences, patched roofs, and replanted fields. The blacksmith rebuilt his forge with the help of the young soldier who had once begged for water, a deserter who chose to stay. People whispered about it at first, but the girl said nothing. She understood that the boundaries between enemy and ally had blurred long ago. What mattered now was survival, rebuilding, and remembering who they had been before fear ruled their hearts. One morning, as she carried a basket of bread through the village, she noticed something unusual: children playing where the soldiers' tents had once stood. They were pretending to be explorers, searching for hidden treasure. Their laughter echoed across the fields, bright and defiant. It was the first time she smiled without restraint. She realized that this was how healing began. Not with grand gestures, but with small, ordinary moments that defied the memory of despair. Still, she felt the weight of what she had done. Not guilt, exactly, but the burden of memory. The resistance had been born out of desperation, and though it had saved them, it had also taken something from her. The simple innocence of believing the world was fair. She carried that loss quietly, like a scar no one could see. One evening, as the sun set in bands of gold and crimson, she climbed the hill overlooking the valley. The fields shimmered below, dotted with lanterns. The people moved like sparks of life against the vastness of the land. From here, she could see the path the army had taken, fading into the distance, swallowed by forest and time. She wondered if anyone would ever tell their story, not as heroes or martyrs, but as survivors who learned to outthink an empire. She hoped so. She didn't want their story to vanish into silence again. As night fell, she sat in the grass, the cool wind brushing her face. Somewhere far away, thunder rumbled, a reminder that peace was never permanent, only borrowed. But she wasn't afraid. She had faced storms before. She had learned that even in darkness, light could be built from patience, from cleverness, from the quiet courage of those the world called powerless. She closed her eyes and listened to the valley breathe, steady and alive once more. Long after Plato's voice had faded into history, the legend of Atlantis continued to travel through the minds of dreamers, philosophers, and seekers of lost truths. The story refused to die because it was more than a tale. It was a mirror reflecting humanity's deepest questions. Where did we come from? What have we forgotten? And what price do we pay for progress? Each age found new meaning in the myth, reshaping it to fit its fears and obsessions. During the Middle Ages, Atlantis was whispered about as a remnant of the antediluvian world, destroyed in the Great Flood of Noah. In the Renaissance, explorers searching for new lands across the ocean imagined they might find its remnants in the unknown West. By the time the New World was discovered, the story had transformed again, from warning to promise, from memory to mythic destiny. The Age of Discovery rekindled humanity's fascination with the idea of lost worlds. As European ships crossed the Atlantic and encountered vast, mysterious continents, many believed they were tracing the outlines of the ancient Atlantean Empire. Scholars and sailors alike speculated that the Mayans, the Aztecs, and the Incas were the descendants of that forgotten civilization. The pyramids of the Americas seemed to echo those of Egypt, as if the two were distant cousins of the same architectural memory. Across maps and manuscripts, the shadow of Atlantis grew larger, transforming from a story of destruction into one of origin. Humanity, it seemed, wanted Atlantis not to have fallen, but to have survived. Yet behind the excitement of discovery lingered a deeper unease. As explorers described the vast wealth of gold, the intricate cities, and the wisdom of indigenous civilizations, Europe's thinkers began to wonder whether the lost world had already been rediscovered, and whether its new conquerors were repeating the same sins that had once doomed it. Greed, conquest, and pride spread across oceans just as they once had across Atlantis. The parallels were uncanny. Even as men searched for a sunken paradise, they were unknowingly rebuilding its fate. The pattern had returned again, this time gilded in exploration and conquest, clothed in the illusion of progress. Through the Enlightenment, Atlantis evolved into a symbol of utopia. Philosophers like Francis Bacon imagined it as a place of perfect knowledge and harmony, a society guided by science, reason, and moral order. In his work The New Atlantis, Bacon described an island of wisdom where humanity had finally mastered nature without destroying it. It was not the Atlantis of Plato's warning, but its inverse, the vision of what could be if humanity learned from its past. Bacon's utopia was an act of hope, that reason might succeed where arrogance had failed, that knowledge could be used to heal instead of dominate. But even this ideal carried within it the seed of danger. For the dream of mastery, no matter how noble, still echoed the same desire that had once summoned the flood. In the centuries that followed, the myth of Atlantis would take on new forms, spiritual, mystical, even pseudoscientific. In the 19th century, when technology began to accelerate faster than philosophy could comprehend, people once again looked backward to explain the future. Writers like Ignatius Donnelly revived the legend as historical fact, proposing that Atlantis had been the cradle of all civilization, its knowledge scattered across the earth after its fall. His book Atlantis, The Antediluvian World, captured the imagination of millions, igniting an era of speculation that blurred the line between archaeology and fantasy. To a world witnessing the rise of industry, the myth became an allegory for the cost of progress, the fear that humanity's newfound power could, once again, lead to its undoing. Meanwhile, artists and poets transformed Atlantis into a symbol of longing, the unreachable paradise, the lost Eden that haunted the human heart. Painters envisioned gleaming domes beneath the sea, composers wrote symphonies inspired by its descent. In their imaginations, Atlantis was not only a place but a feeling, the ache of something perfect that slipped away, a yearning for harmony that could never fully return. This emotional core kept the myth alive even as science dismissed it. For while scholars debated its geography, ordinary people felt its truth. Everyone, in some way, has their own Atlantis, a memory of a world before loss. But in the modern age, as technology grew more powerful and the earth more fragile, the story began to sound less mythical and more prophetic. The floods of the ancient world echoed in the rising seas of our own time. The warnings carved in myth found their reflection in melting glaciers, collapsing ecosystems, and fires that burned where they should not. Once again, humanity found itself standing at the same crossroads as its ancestors: power without restraint, knowledge without humility. The legend of Atlantis had always been about cycles, and now the cycle was turning once more. Scientists studying climate patterns and ancient geology found that the world had indeed experienced cataclysms before: massive floods, shifting poles, sudden climate collapses. The younger Drya's impact theory, dismissed for decades, returned with mounting evidence. It seemed the Earth had always spoken through disaster, reminding its children of balance and consequence. And yet, as in ages past, many refused to listen. Humanity had reached beyond the atmosphere, mapped the genome, and bent the atom, but it had not yet learned the simplest lesson written in the ruins of every fallen age: power divorced from humility leads only to silence. Still, even within that silence, there is hope. The story of Atlantis has survived not because it is about destruction, but because it carries the memory of renewal. Every fall, no matter how great, gives birth to something new. Just as the survivors of the first flood carried their knowledge into a new dawn, so too do we carry within us the chance to remember. Atlantis, if it ever existed, was not meant to be found. It was meant to be understood. Its true location is not beneath the sea, but within the pattern of history and the depths of human nature. The warning has always been there. The sea rises not to punish, but to cleanse, not to end, but to begin again. And so the myth continues to evolve, adapting to every generation that inherits it. In an age of science, it becomes metaphor. In an age of crisis, it becomes prophecy. It reminds us that what we destroy, we must one day rebuild. What we forget, we must one day relearn. Atlantis may have fallen beneath the waves, but it rises again each time humanity chooses wisdom over pride, creation over consumption, memory over amnesia. The story is eternal because its truth is eternal. Every time we stand on the edge of change, every time we watch the world tremble beneath our own making, the waves whisper the same lesson the ancients once learned: remember the sea. It is patient, it is vast, and it always comes for what is owed. And yet, even in its consuming depths, it gives back life. In that paradox lies the beauty of Atlantis, not as a tragedy, but as a cycle. The flood, the fall, the silence, the rebirth. The myth that began with a warning ends with a promise, that from the depths of every destruction, humanity may yet find its way back to balance, if only it remembers why it fell. Years passed, and the valley became peaceful again, though the memory of war lingered in whispers. Children born after the conflict grew up without understanding why their parents flinched at sudden noises or paused before lighting a lantern at night. The world beyond the hills had changed too. New rulers rose, treaties were signed and broken, maps were redrawn. But the village endured, untouched by the noise of power and politics. It had learned a quieter strength, the kind that came from survival, from knowing what it meant to lose everything and still rebuild. The girl, now a woman, carried herself with that same quietness. Her eyes still held the calm of the river and the fire of memory. When strangers passed through, they sometimes noticed her, sensing something unusual, a presence that felt steady, as if she had seen the world's chaos and chosen peace anyway. She worked at the mill now, alongside her father, who had grown old but still strong enough to lift a sack of grain. Together they repaired the wheel, reinforced the beams, and watched the steady rhythm of water turn wood into motion. The sound soothed her, a heartbeat of the valley, eternal and patient. Each rotation reminded her of time's slow mercy, how even the deepest wounds could smooth over if given enough turns. She often spoke little while working, her mind adrift in thought, but those who worked near her said her silence was comforting, not cold. Sometimes, in the evenings, she would walk up the same hill where she had once watched the enemy's campfires. The view was different now, fields golden with wheat, roofs patched and shining under the sun. She would sit beneath the old oak tree and watch the shadows stretch across the land. The scars of the past had faded, though never completely. The blackened stone where the soldiers had burned their fires was still visible if one knew where to look. She didn't wish it gone. It reminded her of what had been overcome, of what vigilance cost. The world might call it peace, but she knew peace was never the absence of conflict. It was the hard work of remembering, of not allowing fear to rule again. One summer afternoon, a traveler arrived from the capital. He was a scholar, gray-haired and thin, carrying a satchel full of parchment and quills. He had heard rumors, he said, of a small valley that had resisted an army, not with weapons, but with wit and will. The villagers were amused. They pointed him toward the mill, saying, "If you want the truth, talk to her." When he approached, she greeted him politely, wiping flour from her hands. He asked to hear the story, and though she resisted at first, the gentleness in his manner persuaded her. They sat by the water wheel as she spoke, not dramatically, not as one who sought to impress, but simply, like someone recounting an old dream. She told him of the occupation, the fear, the small acts of defiance that grew into something greater. She told him of the traps laid, the misinformation spread, the moment the soldiers turned away. The scholar listened intently, writing nothing down at first, only watching her expression, the cadence of her words. When she finished, he bowed his head. "This should be remembered," he said quietly. "Stories like yours change what history means." She smiled faintly. "History forgets people like us," she said. "It remembers battles and crowns." "Then perhaps it's time history learned to remember differently," he replied. He stayed for several days, speaking with the elders, walking the paths she described. When he finally left, he promised to record what he had learned. Whether he ever did, she never found out. But it didn't matter to her. The story was safe now, not only in ink, but in the hearts of those who had lived it. That was enough. Years continued their slow procession. Her parents passed away, one after another, quietly, without pain. The village gathered each time to honor them, and she stood beside the river, scattering petals into the current. The water carried them away, as it always had, unhurried and eternal. She often thought about how life moved like the river, sometimes fierce, sometimes still, but always forward. She found peace in that rhythm. The world outside grew noisy again. New rulers spoke of expansion, of strength, of reclaiming lost glory. The people of the valley listened politely but did not cheer. They had learned to distrust the loud promises of men who had never known hunger. They tended their fields, repaired their roofs, and kept their hearts steady. When soldiers marched near once more, passing through on their way to some distant border, the villagers offered them bread and water but no allegiance. The woman watched from the window as the uniforms passed, younger faces, same arrogance. She pitied them, but she did not fear them. She knew now that true power did not belong to those with swords, but to those who endured quietly and never forgot who they were. In time, even her hair began to turn silver. The children she once told stories to grew into adults, some staying in the valley, others leaving to find lives beyond the hills. They often wrote back, describing cities filled with noise and wonder, with towers that touched the sky. But when they returned, they always said the same thing: "It's quieter here. It feels alive." She would smile and nod, offering them a place by the fire. The valley had become a refuge not just for her people, but for anyone weary of the world's endless noise. One autumn evening, as golden leaves drifted through the air, she felt something stir, not fear, but a deep, familiar awareness. The air smelled like the past, like the nights of strategy and risk. She walked to the hill once more and watched the horizon. Far away, she saw torches flickering, not invaders this time, but travelers heading home before winter. Still, the sight reminded her of everything that had come before. She closed her eyes and breathed deeply, letting the memory pass through her without pain. She realized, in that moment, that her story, their story, would live on not because of books or songs, but because people needed it. Somewhere, someday, another village would face its own storm. Another girl would stand where she once had, afraid but unbroken. And perhaps that girl would remember a story told long ago about a peasant who outsmarted an army, and find her own courage in it. That, she thought, was enough immortality for anyone. As twilight deepened, she returned to her home, where the fire still glowed softly in the hearth. The sound of the water wheel filled the night, steady as breath. She sat beside the window, wrapped in a shawl, and watched the stars emerge one by one. The world had changed as it always would, but the valley remained, a small, shining truth in a restless world. And within it, the quiet legend of a girl who had refused to be forgotten, carried gently forward by time itself. As the modern world advances further into the digital and technological age, humanity finds itself walking a path eerily similar to the one Plato described so many centuries ago. We live surrounded by the illusion of invincibility, cities illuminated through the night, machines that respond to thought, networks that stretch invisibly across the globe, connecting billions of minds. Yet beneath the hum of progress lies a tremor, faint but constant, as if the earth itself remembers. Our towers rise higher, our data flows faster, but our foundations, ecological, moral, spiritual, are beginning to fracture. The myth of Atlantis, long dismissed as ancient fantasy, feels more like an encrypted prophecy written for this exact moment in history. We have conquered nature with precision and pride, but we have forgotten to listen to her whispers. And whispers, when ignored, always turn into storms. Every great civilization has believed it stood at the pinnacle of existence. The Atlanteans thought so too. They had technology, knowledge, and order. They believed they had tamed the natural forces of their world, bending them to serve their ambitions. But in that control lay the seed of collapse. Today, our satellites map every inch of the Earth, yet we cannot predict the next ecological tipping point. Our algorithms can anticipate behavior, yet we fail to anticipate the moral cost of convenience. Artificial intelligence, genetic engineering, quantum computing, these marvels promise transcendence, but they also mirror the same desire for mastery that once drowned a golden city. We are once again walking the narrow bridge between genius and arrogance, creation and catastrophe. The story of Atlantis lingers not as a myth, but as a mirror held up to our own age. As oceans rise, forests burn, and species vanish, the parallels grow harder to ignore. We are surrounded by small Atlantean echoes, the bleaching reefs of the Pacific, the vanishing islands of the Maldives, the drowned deltas of Bangladesh. Each lost ecosystem is a modern Atlantis, a piece of paradise slipping quietly beneath the tide. Yet these tragedies unfold slowly, almost tenderly, allowing us the luxury of denial. Unlike the sudden cataclysm Plato described, our fall is measured in decades instead of days. The waves creep forward, inch by inch, so we convince ourselves there is still time. But history has never been merciful to those who mistake delay for safety. The water is already at our feet, we simply choose not to feel it. And yet, for all the despair, there remains an undeniable beauty in the resilience of life. Just as the ruins of ancient cities became the foundation for new ones, the damage we cause now could still give birth to renewal, if only we act with humility. The legend of Atlantis was never a commandment to fear the sea. It was an invitation to understand its rhythm. Every flood cleanses, every collapse reshapes. Nature does not destroy for vengeance, it resets for balance. If humanity can learn to move with that rhythm rather than against it, the cycle of destruction may finally end. Perhaps this is the true warning Plato encoded within his tale, not that civilization will perish, but that it must evolve. Across the world, a subtle awakening is taking place. Scientists, philosophers, and spiritual leaders are beginning to speak the same language of balance. Indigenous traditions that once seemed antiquated are now being studied for the wisdom they preserved, ways of living in harmony with land, sea, and spirit. In the Andes, elders tell of the Pachacudi, the world turning over to cleanse itself, a cycle of renewal foretold long before Plato's words. In the Pacific, islanders speak of Moana Nui Akiwa, the great ocean spirit that gives and takes in equal measure. The echoes of Atlantis live in these voices. They remind us that humanity's greatest technology is not the machine, but the ability to remember. To remember that we belong to the earth, not the other way around. Modern philosophers and historians have begun to reinterpret Plato's work not as a literal account, but as a moral map, a symbolic narrative encoded with timeless truths. The fall of Atlantis becomes a metaphor for every moment in history when power eclipsed wisdom. The Roman Empire's decay, the industrial pollution of the 19th century, the digital addictions of the 21st, all are iterations of the same pattern. Each time humanity ascends too high, it forgets the ground beneath its feet. Each time it worships its own reflection, the sea returns to remind it of scale. Perhaps that is why Atlantis was never found. It was never meant to be discovered in the physical world, because it exists in the psychological one. It is the lost continent within us, the part of our collective soul that once knew how to live in balance with the storm. The rediscovery of this inner Atlantis could change everything. It begins not with grand revolutions, but with quiet remembering our connection to water, to soil, to air. When people begin to see rivers not as resources but as living arteries, when cities are designed to breathe rather than suffocate, when technology becomes a servant of balance instead of dominance, the pattern of destruction will finally begin to shift. The myth's power lies not in fear, but in guidance. Atlantis was not destroyed merely by pride, it was forgotten by neglect. Its lesson endures because it asks us not to find a lost city, but to become the kind of civilization that would never lose itself again. The poet Rainer Maria Rilke once wrote, "The future enters into us, in order to transform itself in us, long before it happens." The same could be said of Atlantis. It is not behind us, it is ahead, waiting for us to become worthy of remembering it correctly. When humanity learns to build not in defiance of nature but in collaboration with it, when knowledge becomes compassion rather than conquest, when progress no longer demands sacrifice, then the waters will recede. Atlantis will rise again, not as a city of stone and gold, but as a consciousness, a civilization of memory. Perhaps that is the true end of the myth, not destruction, but awakening. For every story of loss is, at its heart, a story of rediscovery. The ruins beneath the sea are not just remnants of a past civilization, they are metaphors for our own submerged wisdom. If we can learn to listen to the deep, to hear the ocean's slow and patient heartbeat, we may yet uncover the same truth that once guided the Atlanteans before their fall. That power and harmony must coexist, that the world is not ours to rule, but to remember. And so, the legend comes full circle. The sea that swallowed Atlantis now surrounds us, waiting not to punish, but to remind. Humanity stands once more on the edge of its own myth, faced with a choice as ancient as time itself, to repeat the cycle or to finally rise above it. The story of Atlantis was never about what was lost. It was always about what could still be found. Winter came again, softer this time. The cold was familiar, not cruel, a quiet companion that blanketed the valley in white and stilled every sound except the whisper of the wind. Smoke curled lazily from chimneys, carrying the scent of pine and bread. Inside her small cottage by the river, the woman sat near the fire, spinning wool while the flames painted her face in gold and shadow. Her movements were slow, practiced, patient. Each turn of the spindle matched the rhythm of her heartbeat. She had grown old but not fragile. Her spirit was rooted deep, like the oak on the hill that had weathered every storm. She lived alone now, though never lonely. The villagers visited often, bringing gifts of honey, bread, or simply stories to share. They called her aunt or mother, depending on their age, and they sought her advice when crops failed, when a child fell ill, when they quarreled among themselves. Her words carried weight, though she never raised her voice. When she spoke, people listened. They said she had wisdom in her silence, that she could see truths no one else could. She always smiled at that, knowing her wisdom was born not from any special gift, but from having endured enough to understand what truly mattered. In the long winter nights, she would sometimes light a single candle and read by its glow. The parchment the historian had left was still folded neatly in her chest, beside the old letter from the war years. She would take them out, touch the worn edges, and feel the past stir like a warm ember in the ashes. So many seasons had passed since then, so many faces come and gone, yet the memory of that time remained vivid. Not the fear, not the hunger, but the feeling of unity, of defiance, of life pushing back against despair. That was what she had fought for, and that was what still lived on. One morning, as snowflakes drifted across the fields, a knock came at her door. When she opened it, she found a young man standing there, wrapped in a traveler's cloak dusted with frost. His eyes were kind, curious, full of quiet determination. "Are you the miller's daughter?" he asked. She chuckled softly. "Once," she said. "Many years ago." He smiled as if he had expected that answer. "I came to thank you," he said. "My grandmother told me your story when I was little. She said you taught our family what courage really means." The woman tilted her head, studying him. "Your grandmother?" He nodded. "She lived in the town beyond the ridge. Her mother was a child here during the war. She said she remembered the day the soldiers left, said a girl stood by the river and watched them go. She said that girl saved them all." The woman felt her throat tighten. It had been so long since she'd heard anyone speak of that day. "I didn't save them," she said gently. "We saved each other." He smiled again, but there was something reverent in his gaze. "Still," he said, "thank you." He reached into his satchel and drew out a small book bound in dark leather. "The historian who came here long ago, she wrote your story. My family kept a copy. I thought you might like to see it." Her hands trembled slightly as she took it. The cover was worn, the ink faded at the edges, but inside, there it was. The story of the valley, written with care and quiet beauty. She turned the pages slowly, her eyes moving over words that felt both distant and intimate. A nameless peasant girl, whose cunning and courage turned the tide of despair, teaching her people that strength is not found in power, but in wisdom and heart. She closed the book and sat in silence for a long time. The young man waited respectfully, his breath forming small clouds in the cold air. At last, she looked up at him. "She wrote it well," she said softly. "Better than I could have." He smiled. "She said the same thing, that you were the kind of story the world needs to remember." The woman's eyes softened. "The world forgets many things," she said, "but the right ones always find their way back." He stayed for tea and they spoke for hours. About his family, about the changes in the kingdom, about the new roads and the growing cities. When he left, she watched him disappear down the snowy path, the wind tugging at his cloak. The valley seemed larger somehow, more connected to the world beyond. Her story had traveled farther than she ever had. That evening, she placed the book beside the letters in her chest. Then she sat by the fire and let her thoughts wander. She thought of her parents, their hands rough but loving. She thought of the villagers who had stood with her, of the songs sung when the soldiers left, of the river's eternal voice whispering through all those years. Everything had changed, yet everything remained. The world was vast, full of noise and forgetting, but here, in this small valley, the truth still breathed. The days grew shorter, the nights longer. Her steps became slower, her hands a little less steady. But her eyes, those eyes that had once watched an army retreat, still burned with clarity. One morning, she woke to find the snow had stopped and the air was bright with sunlight. She dressed carefully, wrapping herself in a thick shawl, and walked to the hill one last time. The climb was slow, her breath shallow, but she didn't mind. Every step felt like a prayer. At the top, she looked out over the valley. The roofs gleamed under frost, the river wound like silver through the fields, and smoke rose gently into the blue sky. It was quiet, just as it had been that morning so long ago. But this silence was not fear. It was peace, deep and complete. She sat beneath the oak tree, resting her hand against its bark. The tree had grown stronger with each passing year, its roots entwined with the soil of every life lived here. She smiled and closed her eyes, listening to the sound of wind through the branches. In that stillness, she felt everything, the past, the present, and something beyond both. She thought of the girl she once was, standing in the fog, heart pounding, defying the impossible. She wanted to tell that girl that it had all been worth it, the pain, the loss, the waiting, because in the end, the world had been remade by her courage. A single leaf drifted down, brushing her shoulder before falling to the ground. The river below shimmered in the morning light, endless, unbroken. She took a long, slow breath and whispered into the air, "It's yours now, the world, the story, the peace." When the villagers found her later, she was sitting beneath the tree, her face calm, her eyes half open as if she were still watching the horizon. They buried her there, overlooking the valley she had saved. And every spring, the oak bloomed brighter, its leaves catching the sunlight like 1,000 small flames, as if the land itself remembered her and would never let her fade. Years passed, and the story of the peasant girl became legend. Children learned it from their grandparents beside the fire, their small faces glowing in the flickering light. Travelers spoke of it in distant towns, each version slightly changed but carrying the same truth, that wisdom could triumph over force, and that even the humblest soul could shape the course of history. In time, her real name faded from memory, replaced by titles whispered with reverence. The girl by the river, the keeper of courage, the one who made an army turn back. Yet within the valley she was remembered not as a legend, but as a neighbor, a friend, and the quiet voice that once told them to stand when all hope seemed lost. A century later, a scholar from the capital arrived, following traces of the old tale. He found the valley unchanged, the same winding river, the same oak on the hill, its roots deep and strong. Beneath it lay a simple stone, its carving worn smooth by time. No grand epitaph, no title. Only a few faint words, she made them see. The scholar knelt before it and felt a kind of stillness settle over him. In that silence, he understood what the inscription meant. She hadn't sought glory. She had sought awakening, to remind people of their own strength, hidden beneath years of hardship and fear. He spent weeks in the village, collecting old songs, reading faded letters, and piecing together fragments of memory that had survived through generations. What struck him most was not the details of battle or cunning strategy, but the tenderness with which the people spoke of her. They said she was kind before she was brave, patient before she was bold. Her power had never been in commanding others, but in teaching them to trust themselves. He realized then that her story was not about defiance alone. It was about faith, not in gods or kings, but in the quiet endurance of ordinary hearts. When the scholar returned to the city, he wrote her story anew, not as a legend, but as a lesson. He described the cold mornings by the river, the candlelight in her small cottage, the fear that pressed on every soul, and the voice that rose softly, asking them to think, to question, to act. The book became known across the realm, not as a tale of war, but as a testament to wisdom and will. Centuries later, students studying history would read her words and pause, not out of obligation, but out of awe. And somewhere, far beyond the reach of time, where memory and eternity meet, the woman's spirit lingered, not as a ghost, but as a whisper in the world's breath. Whenever someone, anywhere, found the courage to act with quiet resolve, it was said that she was there, unseen but present. For true legacies are not carved in stone or sung in ballads. They live in the choices people make, in the moments they dare to believe they matter. And so, her story never ended. It simply became part of humanity's heartbeat, steady, eternal, and full of light. In the gentle hush of twilight, the valley breathed as it always had, calm, eternal, untouched by the rush of time. The river shimmered beneath a silver moon, carrying reflections of the oak's wide arms across its surface. No voices echoed, yet her presence lingered everywhere, in the wind, in the earth, in the quiet strength of those who still lived here. Somewhere, a mother told her child the story once more, her voice low and warm. And as the stars bloomed above, the world remembered her, not as legend, but as the heartbeat of courage itself.